It's the Chris Salcedo Show. It's hour two. Glad you've made it, everybody, to the program. We're going to be taking your phone calls. I got a full bank of phone calls I will get to after we talk to our guest because, well, a lot of the subject matter we're going to be talking with you about, I suspect, I'm going to be talking about with Ashley. Ashley Brasfield, reporter for the Daily Caller. By the way, love the background. She covers Capitol Hill and political campaigns. Graduate of the University of South Carolina, where she played Division I volleyball. Ashley, welcome back. Again, it was supposed to be one of your colleagues, but you're pinch hitting. So thank you very much for doing that. She had to go cover Hegseth, right? I think that's what was going on there. So look, I think we have a lot to talk about this kinetic action and look, the Iranian strikes, the president is saying we've lost some lives already and we're going to continue to lose lives, but he believes this is worth doing. What is your coverage revealing so far?
Right. Well, I feel like the Sly Stallone soundbite in the intro really set us up for this to talk about. So I appreciate that. I love Sly Stallone myself. But what we found out so far, and what Hegseth just laid out for everyone, our own White House correspondent here at the Daily Caller, Reagan Reese, asked them what these objectives are in going to war with Iran. And, I think there's some hesitation by some of the base, definitely on the left, and what we're doing here, what those objectives are and how they differ from, past wars in the Middle East. And there is hesitation from people in Gen Z, I think, that they want some of those questions answered. And he laid out that these two things from Reagan Reese, they want to end Iran's ability to project power against us and our allies and take away Iran's ability to create and have a nuclear weapon. Obviously, I think those are, pretty broad objectives at this point. And I think maybe the question we should have probably heard from some reporters in the briefing is, how do you measure that? And I think they want to, finish this on America First conditions is something that Hegseth said himself during this, presser. But I think there's a lot of questions here of what the outcome looks like. I think the president has always tried to end things quicker and, long-term wars are not something that they are interested in.
Sure.
After seeing the last 20 years.
This is not George W. Bush.
Right.
This is not the Vietnam conflict. This is not the Korean conflict where presidents start quote unquote wars that last for years. I'm reminded of all of the detractors of the Trump derangement folks. And by the way, all the Democrats are decrying this, save Fetterman, right? Fetterman is the only sane voice, the only grown up on that side. But this president, I remember when he decapitated the regime in Venezuela. We're going to war. We're going to war. Well, no, there was no war. It strikes me this president doesn't undergo protracted wars. Objectives will be met, and once those objectives are met, then it's done. That's my impression. What is yours and those you are hearing from across the political sphere?
Yeah, well, I think, like you said, you're going to have the detractors, the typical, Rand Paul's, Thomas Massey's that aren't against war unless, provoked in the sense. I think Rand Paul was on record stating, I think he would have gone to war after 9/11 due to the fact that we were hit on our homeland. So that's kind of the argument here is also what is war? And, within Congress, which I cover specifically, is the Wars Powers Act, which only makes, the executive branch have to notify people in Congress 2 days 48 hours after the actual incident took place, not prior. So that's kind of the confusion.
It did happen, though.
Right.
The 8 members of Congress, and a secure briefing is coming up. But the 8 pillars, I guess what they call them, I can't remember that. 8 members of Congress were notified about this operation.
Right. And I mean, we saw a military buildup within the region as well. This has been being reported for weeks. There was speculation that when the hit would actually happen, it was a matter of if not when, I think, for a lot of people. And so I do think there's concern. The briefings hopefully will, kind of see some of that amongst members and maybe give Democrats a little bit of a better idea of why it happened. But I do think there's a lot of questions from, our side on the media, what this objective was and how do you measure these and how long this might take. And I don't think it will be a year's 20 to 25 year war, anything like that. But I do think the American people, and I think, if you look at polling, they don't love, military involvement in the Middle East overall.
Right.
I do think that's going to be a factor here. What's that going to look like for midterms? There's multiple things going on in Congress that, Republicans can't even get past. So I think that might play a factor in here. And what was the strategic decision looking at the overall in the broad political sphere? And also, I have a question as to how many Americans actually know this is going on. I think that's another question I've observed in recent weeks to see if this buildup was even, public knowledge amongst the American people.
Right. And I don't think this wasn't a buildup like we saw for the Iraq war, conflict, whatever, which basically kept us at war for many years, and the Afghanistan war, which kept us at war for many, many years. You mentioned the coverage out there, and I'm with the vast majority of Americans who say, I don't want to get mired down in another decades long conflict in the Middle East. I don't think this president does that. However, with the death, with the Ayatollah assuming room temperature, there has been a celebration worldwide, including in the streets of Iran and all over the globe, from journalists, from individuals who were exiled from Iran, and it's been jubilant. There was a CBS reporter right here in my home state in Austin, Texas, who got word that, and I'm going to play it. It's going to be kind of hard to make out, but
Yeah.
you've been on a remote broadcast before. I've been on a remote broadcast before, where you have the people back at the editorial desk telling you what they want to see as far as their shot. Well, this guy's talking to his camera guy, and I'll play it, and then I'll kind of fill in the blanks. But just listen to this.
What's that mean? It means they don't want us to focus on this.
Yeah.
Well, I am.
Yeah, he said they got a whole bunch of people in the background flying Iranian flags and American flags. They're celebrating the death of the Ayatollah, and the CBS fake news desk that this reporter works for in Austin, Texas, says, we don't want to focus on the jubilance being exuded by those who were victimized by the Iranian regime. We don't want to focus on that at all. And that doesn't that speak to the narrative over news that many of these anti-American kooks who run these news outlets portray consistently?
Right. Well, I think that it gives the American people a good eye what a newsroom sometimes look like, especially in mainstream media. And I believe that they were owned by Sinclair Broadcast Group, which is, across the United States. And I think that, there's been certain instances in recent weeks, whether it be, the two Olympic skiers that were asked about whether Trump and his actions with ICE they approve of when they just won their race in the Olympics. The reporter, obviously, I think that was a top-down order from whoever was at the editorial desk for them to ask, and I think it was totally inappropriate. And then, even the men's hockey team being asked about politics. It's wrong timing. I also think that, Caroline Levitt got a ridiculous question from CBS Ed O'Keefe at one point about Black History Month. And, when was the president ever called racist? And she kind of said, are you kidding me? But it's all these instances where, I'm glad this reporter, I think this instance, he kind of was like, I'm covering it. And he said, kind of gave, the screw you to his higher up in this way that people need to see this. And, there's going to be protests, probably against it as well, the strikes. So I think that seeing, the media is there to show the American public a broad spectrum of beliefs and report the news and not give an opinion on what's going on. So that's the objective here. And I think this reporter was in the right. Obviously, we'll see if he gets any repercussions, but I think he's got the public's backing in this instance. And
right, all the pro-Iranian so-called protests out there have been drowned out by, especially in Los Angeles and some of these left-wing cities, by those jubilant over the Ayatollah and his infrastructure being decimated. Right. Ashley Brasfield is our guest right now, folks. She's a reporter for the Daily Caller. Happy to have them on once a week. It is a great publication. I highly recommend it. Let's talk about President Trump's place in history, because I think he has a real sense of what he's doing. But by the conduct or the inaction of Republicans in Congress, like John Thune and the do-nothing Republicans in the Senate, I think the president has a real sense that he could be dealing with a Democrat Congress for the last 2 years of his administration, and that moved up a timetable to make sure that threats that Democrats were willing to allow gather. As a matter of fact, Democrats support anything that threatens the safety and sovereignty of the United States, and people who will find any excuse not to act in our best interests. I think the administration had a real sense that they may be mired down over the next 2 years because of the efforts of Republicans. Do you think that may have advanced the timetable and President Trump righting a great wrong? I think that the 47 years this planet's been afflicted with the regime in Iran is one of the great wrongs. What do you think?
I do think this is going to be a determination whether, with his legacy. And I think you're exactly right. They're facing something where there's a very slim majority in the House. And I think the predictions currently are that Republicans will lose the House and there will be a blue wave coming into November. That's something I've been hearing. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that quite yet, but I do think there's, just symptoms of that already happening. And, you're seeing this with the Senate and the House with the Save America Act specifically. And this is something that long term could save, elections in America, keep their integrity. And, the Senate GOP has been stalling on it. People like John Thune, Mitch McConnell, they had a report came out today saying, people in the House, they're having to make decision. Do you go to war as House GOP against the Senate GOP on this? And these are, inactions that I think would, put a mark on the president's legacy of not being able to get certain things done, not pass his agenda. And that comes back, in the long term as to why, he may have made this strike earlier or not. This also goes back to the Venezuela strike and, the legacy he will leave as the president of the United States. So I do think these are all factors. I think the midterms definitely are playing a, somewhat of a factor in the thought process strategically of what's all happening and playing out in the recent months.
And the Daily Caller, to their credit, putting out the Democrats are just as discombobulated, if not even more so, than the Republican Party right now. They can't. They are so deranged with President Trump derangement syndrome that if something is demonstrably good for the country, they will oppose it. Right. And a lot of people are taking notice that, boy, this election may be lesser of two evils, and it looks like the Fettermans of the world and the Republicans, even with their inaction, seems like a better choice. I don't believe in the blue wave, and the Daily Caller has done a lot to persuade me that it's not real. So let's talk about the future of Iran to bring the conversation full circle, because my understanding, there's a council that has been convened in Iran to choose a new Ayatollah. They didn't just put somebody in there, right? There is no succession. They've got a council, quote unquote, debating. And how would you like to be, Ashley, the guy who draws the short straw of, wait a minute, I'm the Ayatollah, and that you may be marked. And how eager do you think, if the green revolution inside of Iran doesn't rise up and take over their government as the president has asked, how eager the Iranians will be to develop nuclear weapons going forward?
Right. Well, I'm no expert within, I guess, domestic policy within Iran, but I will say, I think the president and the deaths, I think there's up to 40 deaths from Iranian government officials prior. I think from social media, what I was seeing is that they killed the second two options here, and that council is probably needed at this point to possibly choose a second Ayatollah. But I think there is a lot of, I think we have a better understanding in places like Venezuela, where it is, within our hemisphere. But, Iran being a Shia Muslim country, 92 million people, I think you're looking at something here where there's a split that of people. And we saw with, it might have been an organized protest in favor of the IRGC. But there's thousands of individuals within Iran that still support that sector. So I think there are worries, who, comes out on top there, a civil war taking place within the country. And hopefully, I don't think the mission was regime change, but you're looking at regime change now. So what is that going to look like within the country domestically? I'm no expert there, but I do have I'm very, I guess, going to be looking at that council that you're talking about, seeing what they think. And then also, we've seen regime change wars over the last, months and years. How is the outward, international community going to impact who is put in place there? I think that's another question I have.
And I'm delighted that China is sitting back, helpless to do anything about it, that Mother Russia is sitting back, helpless to do anything about it. And at the end of the day, in my mind, this is what it's all about, destroying this coalition, the support for anti-American folks in communist China who have our country's demise at its core. Yes. So we'll see where it all goes. Ashley Brasfield, reporter for the Daily Caller. Thank you very much for pinch hitting for Reagan Reese. I can't thank you enough. Always appreciate the time.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll get Reagan with you next week.
All right. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
There she goes, folks. All right. Telephone number is 281-558-5738, 281-558-KSTV. I have a lot of calls waiting, and I'll get to those phone calls coming up next on the Chris Salcedo Show on the Voice of Texas. Be right back.